SECfans.com. Going to talk a little bit about the ACC championship, not the SEC championship. We've already done that one. We like to venture outside the SEC for games for teams that we're comfortable with, that we've followed all season, and that we like to talk about. And obviously, since the SEC is probably going to have a team in the college football playoffs, we want to have some discussion about some teams that are also on the cusp of punching their ticket to the playoffs. So let's talk about this one. Clemson and Miami. We've got a big one this week. Obviously, these two teams have kind of been on that track to face one another, locking up their division a little sooner than we had in the SEC West. But they had both stubbed their toe along the way. But what's interesting about this is, unlike previous seasons where a loss to an unranked opponent would, probably throw you out of the mix for the playoffs, the season's so weird and there's so much chaos that both of these teams have an unranked loss, but neither one of them are sitting in the same boat as Alabama, who's needing some more chaos to happen ahead of them to get in. These two teams have the luxury of controlling their own destiny, and you gotta, for all of the negativity that Miami has seen, and may as well start with Miami. For all the negativity Miami's probably seen or felt or whatever after that Pitt loss, you gotta feel pretty good sitting where you're sitting right now with the opportunity still probably controlling your own destiny. Not probably, I'm gonna say definitely, to make the playoffs and win your conference. If you win this Saturday, that Pitt loss is a distant memory. So talk about that. Let's discuss maybe not so much a rehash of the Pitt loss, but how fortunate they are to be in this position that they're in, and what it means to be able to play for a championship instead of having to worry about somebody else ahead of you losing.
It's certainly notable, right, that you can go into a game and know, okay, this is winner take all. I don't have to worry about anything happening. And in the ACC's case, it's a lock. Whoever wins this game is going to go to the championship. I think a lot of years it would have been more difficult, right? And you never know quite how things are going to shake out. And it's easy to take it for granted that you're going to get in. I think everyone sort of assumes, okay, well, we got one loss. We've had a very good year. And that's not always going to be the case. Maybe the last 2 years, but before then, there've been a lot of undefeated teams in the playoff. And this is really the first year that the playoffs had to deal with a situation where there aren't so many good teams. There's a lot of sort of gnashing of teeth, and we hear it even within the SEC and about the SEC, about whether or not Alabama should get in. And I think the thing that gets missed in that whole discussion is, okay, do we want to have the discussion of whether Alabama should get in one loss? Does a one-loss team really, that doesn't win their conference, need to play the national title? My opinion is probably not. But we chose to have a 4-team playoff. We chose to put ourselves in a situation where we added teams to the mix. And in all the scenarios that are under consideration where Alabama gets in, you are faced with a choice of either putting a 2-loss team in the playoff or putting a team that that didn't win the conference championship. Luckily, neither one of these really has to have that issue. But I think it's important to understand the context and how much luck and circumstances and context plays into it. Clemson and Miami were in many ways very fortunate that they had things play out the way they did. Clemson and Miami were also fortunate in the fact that they're in different divisions, because it very easily could have been that Clemson and Miami played in the regular season. One of them knocks each other out, maybe in game 2. Then they're not going to play in this championship game. And that could have been their only loss for all we know. So everything kind of aligned right for these teams this year. It's not a bad thing. It's not really anything from that perspective that you can or can't control. One thing you can control, though, is not losing to unranked teams. I just think it's important to understand that, there are 5 power conferences, and a lot of years we've had it where all the power conferences, save maybe one, or maybe all 5, have 1 loss or fewer. If that was the situation, the unranked team thing would have been a real issue. This year, you get to control your own destiny. You lose a game, that's fine. Most of our national champions have lost a game. In fact, I'm trying to think through, right? So we had 2014 Ohio State that lost lost a game in the regular season, and I think it wasn't even an unranked game, and it was Virginia Tech. I don't believe they were ranked that year. 2015, you have Alabama that lost in the regular season. 2016, you have Clemson that lost to the regular season to an unranked Pitt. They ended up being ranked on and off, but regardless, one loss is not unusual for a team. It's really hard to play 12 games in football. We talk about this a lot on the show, that we're very statistics driven, and we talk about what the predictable result is, or really what we're trying to say is this is the average result when teams play a B game against a B game. But, B game for each team, right? But football is a very asymmetric sport. There's a lot of bounces of the ball. Miami had a lot of games this year that were kind of things that could have gone one way or the other, whether a guy catches the ball or not, really sort of a game of inches. And because of that, there's a lot of unpredictability. And because there's a lot of unpredictability, you get games like the Miami Pitt game. And I will say this too, Pittsburgh is not a very good team this year. It wasn't a good thing to lose to Pitt. It's not really excusable in that context in and of itself from a resume perspective. Nothing statistically about that Pitt loss was normal. Miami had not given up or not gained less than 4.5 yards per play all season. The worst they had was the Florida State game. So if you look at it in that context, then you realize the Pitt game really was kind of an aberration. And we're a predictive show. We've talked about it a lot, and I know a lot of Miami fans were kind of thumping their chests when we predicted Notre Dame to do well. Well, that was the flip side to the Notre Dame game, and it's important to understand that. The same way we thought Notre Dame should win the game, and we noted afterwards, look, there was no reason to think Notre Dame should play that poorly, and now they've continued to play poorly, but again, everything Notre Dame did before the Miami game looks totally different statistically, even again when they play worse teams. Miami has played a lot of teams that are a lot better than Pitt, and they have consistently played much better. So that was a bad game, and it was a combination of a lot of factors. It's really tough. The way Notre Dame struggled when they played Miami at Miami, it's really hard to play in a hostile road crowd against a team that is geared up to play against you. That's the buzzsaw they ran into against Pitt. And so I think when you combine all that put together, I think you have to understand the luck factor and everything that goes into it. But one loss is usually not enough to knock you out. They did what they needed to do for both teams. And I think both teams, with Clemson, the Syracuse loss, they were out their quarterback. I will note that they were still losing the game even when the starter was in, but he was banged up to begin the game. Then he goes out. There's a lot of factors that play there. Syracuse took a lot of risky pass plays that happened to pan out. And in the Pitt game, Miami just had everything basically go wrong. I think they made a mistake by going away with Rozier, even though he hadn't been very effective. But, Miami just didn't get the bounces they need in that game, and things just weren't clicking, which happens. So I think both teams are fortunate to be in the position they're in, but I also think they've earned it. And I don't take a whole lot from either one. I think they just had one bad game, and for the most part, the rest of the year, they've been solid to, in Clemson's case, often very dominant.
It's funny you mentioned that it's most of these champions have a loss. Nick Saban during this crazy run at Alabama has just the one undefeated team that was a national champion. It was 2009. So what's considered by many to be, if not the most, one of the most dominant dynasty runs in college football history, and he's still not racking up undefeated seasons. For all of the adding the 12th game being a cupcake, you also add conference championship games, and somewhere in the mix you catch a cupcake that ends up being good, so you never know. It is interesting you also pointed out Syracuse, because Syracuse employed the strategy that we thought Virginia Tech had to employ to have a chance in that game, and that was, for those of you who didn't see the Virginia Tech and Clemson preview, we talked about how, look, Virginia Tech, if they play this game straight up, they're not going to win. They're going to lose. You said 31-17. They lost 31-17. We said the only way for Virginia Tech to win this game is the strategy that could, 1 out of 5 win them, but 4 out of 5 end up in a blowout. And they chose to play it straight up. Syracuse went the opposite route. They played that 1 out of 5 and got it. And in their case, it's probably 1 out of 7 or 8. And like you said, they hit on some shot plays that were probably pretty low probability. But I'm going to give you an opportunity to maybe backtrack a little bit, and if you won't, maybe I will, on the loss to Syracuse being, in the light of what we've seen Syracuse be down the stretch, being maybe a little worse than it looked at the time. I know that Kelly Bryant was hurt, and I know we didn't play the second half, and I know it kind of deflated that team. But we're looking at a team that gave up 60 plus to Wake, that went 4-8 on the season. And for all of the people that look, Clemson can win this game and 100%, even with that bad loss, deserve to be in the playoff. I'm not saying that. I'm saying if we're looking at maybe there's some weaknesses on this team that people aren't saying they have, I'm looking at a team and saying, okay, you lost to someone who was 4-8. If Alabama lost to, say, Arkansas or Vanderbilt, because Jalen Hurts went down in the second quarter, and whether or not that would be a benefit to Alabama is a different story. We'll talk about that in another video. But if they lost Jalen Hurts halfway through that game and they ended up losing to Vanderbilt but beat Auburn at the end of the year, would non-SEC fans be saying, well, man, they lost to Vanderbilt, but they're really dominant? No, I think they'd be saying, man, you couldn't eke out a win against a dumpster fire of a team that lost to MTSU, that gave up 60 to Wake. Like, you couldn't find 21-18 kind of win. So in that light, is it fair that we're completely overlooking this, or does that indicate that there might be some issues with this Clemson team that we don't see because we're covering it with the hurt quarterback thing?
Right. And I think it's important to take what you said and sort of split it into two different discussions, right? On one hand, we have the discussion of how much should this affect the resume? It's the playoff discussion. It's the discussion of, well, we can sort of excuse this because the guy got hurt and it's explainable and it was a one-off. And like we said, there's a lot of low probability things. That's a discussion of whether Clemson deserves to be ranked higher or not. That is distinctly different from the discussion of whether Clemson has issues from a predictive aspect. We've talked a lot in the past, and I'm not making this direct comparison right now, but how the 2012 Notre Dame team had no business being in the national championship from a quality perspective. The argument we haven't necessarily made is that Notre Dame didn't earn the right to be in that game, because it's a different question. Clemson earned the right to be in this game, absolutely, to make the playoff. It's done if they win this conference championship game. And the Pittsburgh loss isn't a huge factor. And so we're not talking about it from that aspect. But from the predictive aspect, I do think it highlighted an issue. And when I talked about the Virginia Tech game, and I said, well, I thought Virginia Tech will either play very aggressively and win in a 1-4 chance, or they're going to lose badly in a 3-4 chance. But I said, well, if they played this game straight up, was a question to me, what is it going to look like? And I said, well, I think it would be 31-17, which was the actual score. The reason I said all that was that I felt like Clemson's back seven was a little more suspect against the pass and certain plays than they'd been made out to be. And what I'd seen from Clemson to that point, and I've seen since then, is once you get them to start rotating their front four and they don't have those starters in there, they start to struggle quite a bit. And you could sort of key off it into say, well, when they came in, I noticed that the back seven couldn't really handle themselves as well as a lot of people probably would have suspected when they didn't have that pass rush. Are they good? Yeah, they're pretty good, but they don't have dominant corners. I think the safeties are pretty average. I think the linebackers are solid, but they're not necessarily elite. They're not quite at the level they have been. They don't have that bullware guy. They don't have the dominant guys on the outside. So what Syracuse was able to do is they played very aggressively. Because they played very aggressively and you start throwing a lot of fades and a lot of shots, that are 50-50 balls. The thing with a 50-50 ball is you throw the ball before the guy breaks. You don't wait for him to get open, you throw it early. That negates the pass rush. They did a lot of stuff to get the ball quickly outside to make the linebackers, the corners, and the safeties make plays one-on-one, and they weren't really able to do it consistently. And the other thing we talked about was defensively, they really challenged Clemson because we said, a lot like we've seen from Jalen Hurts in the SEC, that we've like has become almost a running joke. If you bring a lot of outside pressure, we didn't think Kelly Bryant responded overly well. And as we've talked about, Bryant went out hurt in that game, but they really were doing a pretty good job of him early. And the way they were doing it was they were bringing outside pressure and they were saying, okay, we're going to give you some opportunities down the field, but we're going to bring pressure and we're going to make you make quick decisions. That was effective. And not only was effective, but it was an effective from a team that would lose the next 5 games. And their passing game hadn't been real good since then. So when you look at it from that perspective and you talk about what you can kind of take from that situation, I think there's a lot to be learned from the Clemson game. Now, I think it's important with Syracuse, right, to understand Eric Dungy didn't play the last 3 games, and you could obviously see the collapse when that didn't happen. But Miami, he was 31% passing, 3.3 yards per attempt. Florida State, he was only 56 yards, 56%, 6.5 yards per attempt. Not real great in those games. But against Clemson, a guy that was 0 touchdowns, 4 interceptions against Miami was 3 touchdowns and 0 interceptions. And a lot of that is luck, but a lot of that was the fact that if you want to throw a lot of jump balls and you take a lot of risks, you can exploit them. And I think that's very important because while Rozier has struggled running a traditional passing offense, the reason Miami has been able to win a lot of games late is that Rozier and especially Ahmad are very, very good at taking 50-50 balls and making the most of opportunities. And that is the way you attack Clemson.
All right. So it's funny because I think we look at a team a lot of times. We look at a team through the lens of, unfairly, through the lens of their schedule in terms of how things line up. And the last taste of Clemson we got this year was a blowout win over a South Carolina team that's scrappy, that you and I have been kind of medium on. We didn't think they'd beat Clemson. The video's out there if y'all want to review it. We didn't think they were good enough to beat them, and they weren't. So you have this last 3 games. One is a joke game, and then a big win over Florida State and South Carolina. On the flip side, Miami won their first 11 games and picked the last game to lose. But it doesn't necessarily, I don't necessarily buy that they're a different team in game 12 than they were in game 7 or 8. So are we maybe mentally downplaying Miami's potential in this game just because the last picture we saw of them was Pitt, when in reality, if we take this Miami team as a whole throughout the season, they've got more than a puncher's chance in this game? Maybe we're giving Clemson too much credit and Miami too little, or is it just about right?
I think certainly people are taking a little bit too much from the last game. As we said, there's something to be said from, and I say this as we said in the SEC preview, there's something to be said from an aura of invincibility, and you see it a lot from teams that when they've won and they've won consistently and they don't feel like they can lose, it definitely gives a team an extra spark, and that does matter, and that does help teams find ways to win. And you see a lot of times pretty average teams that go until they either, one, drop a game that they maybe shouldn't, or they miss one of those opportunities, or two, run into a team that's good enough that they can't possibly beat them, and then it's just like the wheels fall off. So to a certain extent, there is a concern there, but my concern is, well, maybe we don't see the same Miami team we saw the rest of the year. But in terms of how good Miami is, that Pitt game was an aberration. And they have been better than that. And they've been average against some mediocre teams where they were good enough to win, but they weren't dominant. And I get all that. But this isn't a bad team. I mean, S&P Plus had them, I think it was 13th last week, which I thought was pretty interesting. And what was really notable to me is if you looked at it was recent history, so it was the past 2 or 3 games in Sagarin's rankings. Sagarin had them 13 overall, but he had them second if you looked at only the past few weeks. And that indicated how much the Virginia Tech game and the Notre Dame game were an explosion of quality. And to me, the Pitt game was just sort of a rubber band back to the norm. And what's happened is people have disregarded the prior 2 big wins in favor of the last loss. And the reality is they are somewhere in the middle. And you can't look at it any game in context. And I know a lot of Miami fans were really kind of aggressive in the comments with us because we didn't think they'd win the Notre Dame game. But the flip side is the same way that we didn't predict that, you wouldn't have predicted the loss to Pittsburgh. You've got to kind of understand that it's ebbs and flows. You can't look at one game, good or bad. Our miss against Notre Dame or the loss against Pittsburgh, they're not very predictive. And we can say that over and over. It's the season as a whole. And the season as a whole, Miami may not be an utterly dominant team, but they are still a pretty darn good one.
And it's funny that you said maybe not dominant, but a pretty darn good one, because we just got finished talking about an Auburn team who's beat number one 2 times in 3 weeks, and them still not being a super dominant team. And I think this year in particular, being a very good team is enough to win a very big game. So I think this is as good a time as any to lead into a computer model that Clemson fans are going to like a little more than the Miami fans, because the sample size for Miami is the 1 game against Notre Dame. And Clemson, I think we've rocked and rolled on them all year. Like, I think we've predicted, the models predicted every game right for them all year and been really close in the final score. So let's see what the computer model says and maybe get into some details on that.
So we've covered both these teams before, and sort of as a rehash, our model takes per play averages. We don't look at total yardage, and we look at from like a per snap basis, how well do you do versus your opponents? How well have your opponents done versus other people they've played? We come up with comparative metrics to say, how good are you really compared to the strength of your competition? We take that, we apply it against each other. So based off the matchups in this game and what each team's strengths are, we're going to look at each other using only historical data to sort of get a predictive yardage total. And then based off, again, purely historical data, we're going to say if you have this much yardage, this is about how many points you're usually able to generate. So there's no personal constants. We don't do anything for injuries. We don't look at a lot of sort of historical trends and weird things because I don't want to put my own stamp on it. This model exists to give you a baseline of statistically B game versus B game. This is how these two teams compare. And it gives you a really good discussion point and starting point. And if you don't like the numbers, you can blame me to a certain extent, but the numbers are what they are. I don't inject myself at all into this model other than sort of how I guess the most basic idea of how I set it up. No personal constants, no subjective data, no weather stuff, no adjustment for home field. This is just pure math. All that said, Clemson has been really all season dominant because they're a dominant run defense. 69% against the run. Anything less than 70% we consider to be elite. Anything less than 60, you get into the realm of historic. And 70 to 80% we say is very good. 80 to really 70 to 80% is really great. And then 80 to 85, very good to good. 85 to 90 is a good defense. Really anything 90 or above tends to be more in the realm of average. So why did I say all that? Because outside Clemson's run defense, everything else is merely very good. Miami's run defense, 84% of opponent averages. Clemson's pass defense, 81% of opponent passing averages. Miami's defense, 87% of opponent passing averages. All those are solid numbers. But I think it's really notable that Miami's defense is pretty darn good, sitting in the 84 to 87% range. But those aren't dominant numbers. And I think they're maybe a little bit lower than some might expect because we've seen this across the board. They allow 3.65 yards per carry, but nobody's running the ball particularly well this year. Their opponents only average 4.3 yards per carry, which is pretty darn low. And similarly, nobody passes the ball well this year. They only give up 6.1 yards per attempt, but their opponents only average 7. So that's how you get up with these numbers being what they are. And again, Clemson's pass defense is pretty darn good, and I think a lot of that is due to the pass rush, but it's still above 80%. It's not elite to dominant in the way it has been sometimes in years past. So there is a little bit of a weakness there. Anyway, moving on. Predicted yardage, it's 5 yards per play for Clemson, 4.9 yards per play for Miami. Not very different. And when you look at it historically, both teams seem to score about the same rate for yardage. And so that's how you end up with a predicted score of Clemson 26, Miami 23.
I don't think that this score, this model is really weird for those of you who didn't see or haven't seen our Auburn Georgia video, which you probably haven't because it's not super relevant to you yet. It had Georgia still winning, so sometimes we get some weird scores out of this, but this one I'm going to go ahead and talk about my gut score. Usually I let you tee that up and then I go after. I'm going to go first on this. 26-23. I don't generally go exactly with the model, but I love this score. I really do. I think Miami is a better team than they're getting credit for, and I'm willing to admit we were wrong on the Notre Dame game, especially defensively. And I think that they're not playing a road game. And I don't think playing a Pitt team when there's a lot of empty seats is a huge road atmosphere, but I think they're playing in an environment that will be energizing and not deflating to them. They'll be mentally, this is a team that thrives on emotion. They're going to get up a lot more for this game than they did for Pitt, and we don't talk about that a lot. We usually talk mostly numbers, but I think a lot of people, if they had to pick a score, would probably say Clemson in a blowout. And I don't think I just don't see that. But I do think right now, if coming into this weekend without any games being played, I had to do my top four ballot for the playoffs, I'd have Clemson at number one. As much as I do not like the Syracuse loss, in any given year, I would say that's red flag city. I'm going with experience as a team and the fact that they have otherwise just handled their business. And I can't say the same for Miami, and I can't say the same for most teams, ironically, besides Alabama, who may not even be in the playoffs. I'd have them at number one. If I have them at number one, I can't have them losing to Miami. So I'm going with the model 26-23. Now tell me what your gut says.
So I think the first thing I'm going to note is we did a preview just last week for Clemson, right? Clemson, South Carolina. And that had that score pretty close. 28 Clemson, 24 South Carolina. First caveat, we've talked about repeatedly in that South Carolina is so utterly bizarre that they break our model because somehow they've managed to score more points when they can't move the football than when they do on a very consistent
Yeah, they
basis.
actually, for those of you who haven't seen us do other South Carolina games, we had a game, I think 3 weeks ago, where the fewer yards per play you gave South Carolina, the more points they got in the model. That's not a calculation error. That's exactly what happened. That's how weird their season has been and how wrong it's made any kind of predictability for them.
But as much as the score was a little weird, the score was weird from the South Carolina aspect. It really wasn't too far off from where Clemson was going to be. It predicted that they'd score 28 points. He scored 34, still sort of in the same realm. It predicted 5.4 yards per play for Clemson in that game just last week. Clemson had 5.65 yards per play. So we were off by 0.25 yards per play. That's pretty close. If you look at the passing averages, rushing average, we said they'd get about 6.2 yards per attempt, about 4.6 yards per carry. They had 7.5 yards per attempt, 4.1 yards per carry, so a little bit worse against the run, a little bit better against the pass, still sort of in the same realm. So I say all that to say, model not necessarily too far off. The one area it was wrong was South Carolina scoring, but as we said, there's no rhyme or consistency to it. We didn't know what they were going to do. Some days they show up, some days they don't. But I feel like coming out of that, it kind of has Clemson pegged. So looking into this game, to me, the question mark is Miami. I think 26 points for Clemson is probably pretty fair against a team generally of Miami's caliber. But the last time we saw Miami play a team that had a run-first quarterback, that was Notre Dame, and they completely shut them down. On the flip side, I also don't think Miami is necessarily equipped offensively to move the ball all that well against Clemson. Clemson's defense is very good, and more importantly, they're very good against the run, which is going to force Rozier to win the game. So, all told, I'm not too far off from the model. It's interesting to me that, for example, Clemson scored at least 30 points for the last 4 games, dating back to that weird stretch around Syracuse where Kelly Bryant wasn't in, and they've scored at least 30 points in every game where Kelly Bryant was basically in the game. I think the model's dead on that they're going to struggle more in this game than they have really any other game but Auburn with Bryant. But I also think the model is dead on that Miami is probably going to struggle just as much when the game is put on Rozier's shoulders. So I think it's actually a little more low scoring. I'm going to go probably 24-21 as a random guess, but I do think Clemson has a slight edge, but I think this is going to be a low scoring game. I think both teams are going to struggle more than they're accustomed, and we talk about this a lot on the show. Anytime the score starts creeping to 20 points or below, really anything less than 24 points, which is what we're in now, you're dealing with about 3 touchdowns. We're saying Miami scores 3 scores. That means 1 fumble return, 1 punt return, 1 instance of that really probably at this point overly used turnover chain coming out to play can change the entire course of a ball game because you have only 3 or 4 possessions that are going to determine who wins. And because of that, this is a very high variability game. It's not one I would never touch. We're not a gambling site. I don't personally gamble. Neither does Daniel. But I do think Clemson has the slight edge here, but I do think it's going to be a low-scoring game, and I do think it's one that absolutely anything can happen.
And it's funny because both of us have same spread, kind of pegging us the same way. Usually we deviate a little bit. Even if we pick the same winner, we kind of deviate. I know Miami fans are just ready to remind us how we missed Notre Dame, which is fine. Which leads me to wrapping up this one. So we want your comments. So Clemson fans, Miami fans, mix it up in the comments. Give us your score predictions. Also tell us who you think is going to be the MVP. But remember 2 things. 1, let's play it clean in the comments. And 2, if you're going to give us a comment, back it up with data. That way we can engage you in kind of a higher level numbers discussion, which we so much like to do. So thanks so much, y'all. If you like this video, how about a like? If you love it, we'd love a subscribe. Even though we are SEC fans, we break outside of the conference every week and talk about a big game. And we also have some observations coming up on the draft next year. We're going to cover a lot of bowl games, some inside the SEC, some out. So we've got content that may be more relevant to you than just listen to us talk about Alabama, Auburn, and Georgia. So thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.